Welcome to Age of Noob everyone, and let's review an upcoming historical RTS game called The Fertile Crescent, which is developed by an indie company called Wheel Interactive and published by the Knights of Unity. Be sure to stick around until the very end, as there will be some giveaways announced. Before we delve into the video, I want to make two quick disclaimers. The first is that this is a sponsored video. The developers reached out to me to make a review video of their game, and I happily agreed as their project looked interesting and the RTS genre could definitely use some help for sure. That said, rest assured that this review will be completely free of bias, as you will get my honest take as usual on the game, and I've communicated this fact to the developers as well. Second, the game will release as an early access title. This means that the release date of March 29th isn't the full release of the game, so there will be missing features, some bugs, oversights, and so on that the developers will look to the players to point out to be improved in future builds. This review will obviously take that into consideration, so keep an open mind for now. Alright, with that all said, let's get right into it. The setting of the Fertile Crescent is in its name, near the East Bronze Age era. You'll of course immediately get that retro feeling, as the game is based on pixel art, and the menus, sounds, and overall vibe of the game could bring some of you some nostalgic vibes from games you've played in the 90s. Although pixel art games is not for everyone, they definitely have their charm in my opinion. The game is heavily influenced by Age of Empires of course, a fact acknowledged by the developers, but it is far from being a clone, as there are multiple different game mechanics that we'll dive into later. Looking at the game directly, my mind immediately went to Civilization 3. Although this is a real-time strategy game, its tile-based presentation is more pronounced compared to the original AoE games, both visually and gameplay-wise. The menu system has a very classic look and is very straightforward. I wish they tried something similar to what Age of Empires 2 did originally with its iconic menu system. Hence, although it's nothing special, it gets the job done. All in all, the presentation of TFC borrows elements from both the original Age of Empires and Civilization 3, and makes its own unique look through its pixel art. For an indie game, I'd say they've done a good job. TFC has a quick tutorial to get you started on the mechanics of the game. You're accompanied by a narrator who walks you through what to do and what each thing does.
Hi, and welcome. This tutorial is aimed at players who are new to real-time strategy games. Even if you are a veteran, you might want to go through the tutorial to see what the Fertile Crescent is all about.
His voice is so soothing that I could honestly listen to the tutorial playthrough on loop while I go to sleep, so good job on the narration. The tutorial is quite brief and only covers basics of your economy and doesn't get into military at all. I think they'll expand on this later, but it's lacking currently on the most recent build. Speaking of tutorials, let's walk through the basic premise of the game. While all RTS games revolve around the idea of gathering resources, building an army, and destroying your enemy, the Fertile Crescent has a few tricks up its sleeve. You start the game with a unit called the Tribe, some villagers, and a scout. The Tribe unit basically allows you to place your initial village center wherever you want at the start of the game. Kinda like the Settler in the Civilization series. Once you've picked your location, the tribe then disappears and you have to use your villagers to finish constructing the village center, which then begins training villagers automatically. You can technically halt this auto-training of villagers manually, but more on that later. As is the case with all RTSs, you then will try to grow your economy from there, expand your territory, train an army, and raise your opponents to the ground. Having said that, the game mainly revolves around the most important resource, food. There are 3 other resources in the game, namely wood, clay, and metal, but we'll get to those in a moment. The reason why food is so important that it has a bar graph for its own on the top left is for a few reasons. First, unlike Age of Empires where you do not need an upkeep of any resource at any point to survive, running out of food in the Fertile Crescent results in your villagers and army to revolt against you, effectively ending the game. Second, food is a resource that is consumed by every unit you create in the game, and the more units you have, the faster you'll consume through your food, and the more food income you'll need to maintain to ensure you don't starve and eventually lose. Surplus of food gives you pretty decent villager training time bonuses as well as faster knowledge points generation. On the other hand, if you cannot maintain enough food production to keep up with your consumption, your civilization goes into starvation, which is the time window the game allows you to recover before the revolt finally happens and the game ends. Starvation is nothing to scoff at, as it completely halts knowledge points generation and reduces your villager production speed by 50%. So yes, avoiding starvation is a huge deal in this game, and unlike other RTS games, maintaining a surplus of food to a certain limit is rewarded in the long run. You may have asked what on earth are knowledge points? Well, it's a similar system to how Civilization implements main technologies. Your village center accumulates knowledge points with time, and you can spend those points on the tech tree, ranging from eco upgrades to military ones. As mentioned, this is directly correlated with your food income, and it makes sense from a historical perspective. A surplus of food and prosperity led to less time spent on surviving the day-to-day and more time on scientific and cultural aspects to have breakthroughs. We're not done with food yet, as there's more to elaborate. As of today, there are 3 sources of food: fruit trees, huntables such as deers and boars, and farms. The typical premise of progression from the early start of fruit trees and huntables towards farming at later stages is no different here. But what is different is where you choose to farm. After all, the game is called the Fertile Crescent. There are 4 different tiles you'll see. The first one is the arid tile, which is white. The second is plain, which is the lightest shade of green. The third is grassland, which is the mid-tone green. And the fourth is wet grassland, which is the darkest shade of green in the game. There are also marshlands, but I'll get to that in a second. As you may have already guessed, the colors you see are not just cosmetic, as you'd rather farm on the more fertile lands due to the quicker food gather rates. I don't know the exact percentages, as the game doesn't really tell you the specifics yet, but I think I saw roughly a 30% gather speed difference between a farm on wet grassland compared to one on arid land. That said, the game does a pretty good job visualizing the quality of the farm through a quick gauge, as a farm can be placed on multiple tiles of different kinds. But yes, unlike Age of Empires where you can farm on the driest of deserts or the freaking snow, fertile land and expansion has strategic depth in this game. The other resources are a lot more straightforward. Clay can be gathered by constructing a clay pit on the marshlands that I mentioned above, and is used as a resource to construct various buildings. Wood can be chopped from trees, of course, and is used for both buildings and training units. And metal, which can be mined, is used for training units and upgrading them as well. I tried looking everywhere to check if I was wrong, but I don't think there's a population limit in this game, so you can train as many units as you want. Realistically though, if you cannot keep up with the food production, you will end up starving, and that pretty much halts everything. In other words, while there is no hard cap on the population size, the game self-regulates players through the food consumption mechanic. Buildings-wise, you can construct dwellings for housing your population, resource camps to drop off food from hunt, wood, and metal, exactly like the original Age of Empires, clay pits to gather clay from marshlands, farms to farm, granaries to drop off food, markets to trade resources, furnaces to upgrade the armor and the weapons of your military, barracks to train melee units, archery ranges to train range units, workshops to train siege units, watchtowers, walls, and gates for fortifications, palaces for various use cases such as unlocking certain units and technologies, and wonders for you know why. Overall, nothing out of the ordinary here. You may have realized the lack of stables, but more on that later. Most buildings are self-explanatory, but let's take a closer look at some of them. One peculiar thing that I found out is that the market doesn't really allow you to trade all 4 resources on all directions. Not sure if this is by design or will be patched out later, but I guess this is a byproduct of the lack of gold as a resource in the game. Also, the trade ratios between resources are static and do not change as you trade like it does in Age of Empires. One thing to keep in mind is that there are no trade units in this game. The only resource that can be infinitely generated is food, as farms do not run out, so you'll have to trade food late game at the market to get other resources once everything has depleted. Woodlines in this game aren't really that abundant or rich, so chopping through all the wood in a late game scenario should not be surprising. Since market prices are not elastic and won't bottom out, this should avoid games to turn to a food-only army war. But I'm sure the balance around markets, resources, and even the introduction of trading could change all of this in the future. And finally, the game has only one map style that generates randomly, but that's pretty much it. There are no cliffs, no hills, no mountains, and no water. Apart from finding fertile land to farm and marshlands to extract clay from, there is no strategy behind terrain at all, be it economically or militarily. To be fair, the developers did mention that they plan to add water and water units in the future, but the terrain lacks variety as it stands in the current version. There are 3 types of military units you can create: melee units from the barracks, range units from the archer range, and siege units from the workshop. From the barracks, you can train the light axemen, heavy axemen, spearmen, and the swordsmen. From the archer range, you can train slingers, javelin throwers, and archers. And finally, from the workshop, you can train both the sappers and the battering rams. As far as I could tell, there are no hidden bonus damages amongst units, at least before the technologies kick in. Every unit has a movement speed, melee and ranged armor, melee and ranged attack against other units, attack against buildings, the range of their ranged attack, and how much food they consume per 10 seconds. There isn't a clear rock, paper, scissors system here, but there are some clear choices to make regarding unit composition. For example, the spearman has high pierce armor to tank the damage from enemy range units and is excellent for frontlining. The axemen, heavy axemen, and swordsmen on the other hand differ primarily in their attack values, but they seem mostly about what you can afford rather than countering what the enemy has. Similarly for ranged units, the javelin thrower is the fastest and has the most damage, but with the lowest range. Slingers are kinda in between, and archers have the most range and good damage. Here's the problem problem though. Who is really supposed to counter the archers? Almost all other metrics seem irrelevant since the archers can healthily deal with the other two ranged units. The slingers get outranged and outgunned by the archers, and the javelin throwers get outranged by threefold and don't have enough pierce armor to survive against the archers' damage to close the gap. There are no mangonels or other long-range siege units that can deal with archers either. To be honest, there's not much point to dwell on balance too deep right now, as it's an early access game that will no doubt be patched numerous times before the full release. For now, all I'm saying is that be prepared to play through some short-lived metas of a few broken units until the devs figure it out. The lack of cavalry to counter range units puts the devs in a tricky spot to balance the game, as a third element in the general rock-paper-scissors formula is missing. Perhaps chariots could be an option as a mobile, area-friendly unit? As a side note, one thing I really like is the visualization of who's garrisoned on top of the watchtower. The combat mechanics of the watchtower are also great, as they give increased line of sight and a longer range for the garrison units, as well as 40% reduced incoming damage. That said, even if the devs balance the game well, there isn't much depth in the combat overall. I feel like the battles in the game will be mostly reduced to who can outproduce the other player. Terrain doesn't affect combat at all. The lack of clear counters, lack of variety of units, lack of army maneuvering, and complete lack of civilization choices make the combat very straightforward. This means that once the initial optimal build orders are figured out, there will be really only one way to play the game at the top level. Obviously, the majority of the player base will be average players and will deal less with this issue. As a final note, military units have no formations whatsoever. It is nowhere near as bad as the abomination of pathing that the original Age of Empires has, but I'll get deeper into this in the control section. For now, know that the micro potential in this game is very limited, as your military units can only be ordered to attack, move, or to stop, nothing else. The Fertile Crescent has both single player and multiplayer as expected. Under single player, you can either play the skirmish mode or the horde mode against the AI. You can start both modes on a variety of different difficulty levels, which is great. But that's pretty much it. You cannot change the map because there's only one. You cannot change its size. You cannot set up a team game of 2v2, 3v3, or 4v4, as you can't play anything aside from a 1v1 on the same map. As mentioned before, there are no factions or civilizations in the game at launch, and you cannot select your color either. This is where the game clearly shows that it is still in its early stages, and we'll have to wait for these features to be introduced later on. I did get a confirmation that there will be a branching off into different civ types for military units, so this means that there are plans to add depth to the game for sure. But having said that, the skirmish mode is really bare bones for the time being. Thankfully, the horde mode is excellent, and is something I wish Age of Empires implemented as well. You basically begin in the middle of the map and start the game as usual. You can then scout the area and decide where to place your village center. Once you do that, the clock will be ticking, and when the grace time is up, a wave of enemy soldiers will attack your town from a direction showcased on the minimap. This will repeat 8 times, and each wave will get progressively more difficult. Hence, you'll first defend against a single direction wave of just light axemen, compared to a mixed army composition attacking from multiple angles in latter waves. I think what this game mode is missing is a co-op mode. This could honestly be so much fun to play with friends, as you could work together to hold off the invasions. It is also great to play with friends who may not be at your skill level, as you'd have to work together once you tune the difficulty accordingly. The developers did mention on a community post that they will likely add the co-op feature, so it's great that they listen to the community for their feedback. But that's pretty much it. The devs told me that they do plan on adding a conquest mode to single player, which would mimic a campaign or story mode on other games, though they mentioned that the details aren't finalized and is currently not their priority. To wrap up single player, the AI difficulties seem to ramp up smoothly. It's obviously very difficult for me to gauge how good the AI is this early, as none of us know how to play the game at a high level yet, but during my testing, I didn't find anything jarring. In fact, I even tested poking around the AI's villagers just to see how they react. And I was impressed that the villagers initially began reacting and attacking back at my military unit, but when I tried to pull the villagers away from their base to cause idle time, they decided to stop chasing and return back to work. This is a good sign overall that the AI isn't brain dead. That said, I'm sure that the players will eventually find exploits here and there after the game is released, but I think the AI should do a decent job for most of the casual player base. Regarding multiplayer, I was pleased to see multiple servers across the world, which hopefully should be good news in terms of ping. Unfortunately, multiplayer systems were not live for the pre-release copy that I was given, so I could not test the smoothness of the experience of the multiplayer games in TFC. That said, the lobby system implemented is almost identical to that of Age of Empires 2 and 4. After connecting to your preferred server, you can join one of the lobbies created by others on the lobby list, or you can create one of your own. Just like the single player though, it's bare bones here as well, as the only thing that you can change is the map size from 2 to 4, and which team the players are assigned to. There's nothing else here, not even Elo. I did ask the devs if they plan on introducing a matchmaking system, and they said that it won't be available by launch. They mentioned that players can use their official Discord server as means for them to find others to play with. In my opinion, the devs should prioritize implementing the matchmaking system as soon as they can. Elos and ladders matter, especially if the game lacks single-player content. They should introduce a basic elo rating for the lobby system at least to make the games more bearable and balanced. To wrap up gameplay, I think the main focus on food is a fantastic game mechanic that has a ton of potential with some tweaks in the future. In TFC, you cannot sit on and fortify a tiny land to eventually amass a large army like you can in Age of Empires, as being active and controlling fertile lands matter if you want to grow and train a larger army. I wish there was an emphasis on water as well, such as settling near rivers like it is in the Civilization series, but the food consumption mechanic alone is a breath of fresh air that separates TFC's gameplay enough from the pack, so good job to the game designers on this one. Given that TFC is a pixel game, visuals and graphics will be judged a different way. Although pixel games have a style that you either like or don't, there are still a few things that we need to dive into. Of course, this style has a few things going for it naturally. There's no complex lighting, camera angles, or 3D engine related challenges some games face regarding gameplay clarity. It's not only sprite-based, but also a pixel game, so clarity of the tiles is undoubtedly top-notch. You can very clearly distinguish the fertility of the land and the resources on the map. No complaints here. That said, you'd expect that a sprite-based, isometric game would have no issues when it comes to clarity around buildings, as is the case with Age of Empires 2 for example. But I think they could have done a better job at a few things. Take a look at the difference between the barracks and the archer range. Both of them use this 8-pixel dummy in the middle, and even though structurally they look different, I don't think that the average player, especially a non-RTS player, would know which is which just by looking at them. Placing crossing swords anywhere on the barracks walls and placing target dummies for the archer range should help differentiate them easily. I also think that the colors in the buildings should be more pronounced, especially if there's a blue and a cyan player next to one another. If I had to nitpick, some of the dwellings in the resource pit also look too similar, but I can live with it. If the developers do watch this video, I still recommend them to tweak these for sure. But apart from that, the rest of the buildings are very clear and easily distinguishable. Units, on the other hand, need a bit more work in my opinion. Take a look at the villager and the scout. Yes, the scout has a stick, but they're too similar to one another in my opinion. This is especially true if they're all close and bundled up together. It would be like finding Waldo here, and that's just not good design if I really have to look closely to pick out the scout from the pack. Another example is the javelin thrower and the spearman. Again, I can technically tell which is which if I look closely, but when they're all bundled up together, you'll definitely miss it. Perhaps the shield of the spearman could be fully rectangular with sharp angles, and the javelin throwers would be a smooth circle to help differentiate the two. There are a few other examples, but you get the point. They need to find a way to further differentiate some units from one another. Apart from that, the upgrades you get from the furnace actually do change the appearance of the weapons and the armor of your units as well. For example, getting the copper and bronze helmet upgrades change the color of every unit's helmet. Same thing goes with the color of the tip of the spears and other weapons. It's subtle, but you should be able to tell the difference. A similar thing happens when you research the wheel on the technology tree. Villagers who used to carry with hand switch to using a wheelbarrow instead. All of this is obviously not just cosmetic, as these visual cues should immediately give you the information about the level of technology your opponent has already researched at a glance. Great job to the designers on this one. Another really nice touch on the UI is seeing the occupancy of the farms. When you click any villager, you'll be able to tell clearly which farms are worked and which ones aren't. This is especially useful after a raid where you had to pull villagers to fight and reassign them back to work. Regarding the UI itself, I think they did a decent job overall with the resources and the minimap. That said, the UI's bottom right section needs a bit of work. The unit stats section is pretty good, but they need to group the armors, the attacks, and so on so it's not all over the place. It took me quite some time to get used to what's what because they're all indiscriminately next to one another in a weird order. For example, the melee and pierce armors are displayed side by side, while the melee and pierce damages are aligned vertically instead. This may sound like nitpicking, but it's very important to not intimidate newer, casual players. And if this UI info system confused me initially as an enthusiast, it sure as hell will confuse the average player as well. Another thing they need to change is the repair icon versus the open construction building icon. You folks have no idea how many times I clicked on the repair icon by mistake when I wanted to build something with a villager. It got so bad that I ended up just memorizing the hotkey for opening up the buildings pane as I kept on instinctively clicking on the hammer to build something, especially since it's in the top row. Regarding the building icons themselves, I'm not a big fan. If you use hotkeys, this won't matter much, but not all players use hotkeys. Once again, it took me a long time to get used to what's where. The granary and the farm icons, for example, look too alike. The clay pit and the market don't really tell me instinctively what they are, and the palace and the wonder could be easily mixed up as well. I think they need to go with the more colorful approach that they went with in the furnace. Icons are super clear there, and they can do the same here as well. And finally, I wish there was at least some sort of fire to visually aid players on how damaged the buildings are without the need of looking at the building's HP bars. A small detail that I'm sure will be implemented at some point before the full release. Alright, let's summarize everything we've covered so far within the context of an early access indie game, and score each of the major pillars with what it is now as well as what it could potentially be. The presentation gets a 7 out of 10 score for both its current state as well as its potential. There is no intro cinematic, no flashy animations, nothing spectacular or a wow factor. I've seen other pixel games really push the envelope, and while TFC isn't in the same league, it still does a pretty good job conveying the setting of the game and immerses the player just enough. Hence, can there be a lot more done to improve the production value of the game? Absolutely. Will an indie company spend extra resources on this? Most likely not. Wheeled Games will likely focus their efforts on improving and adding to the gameplay, so I don't expect the needle moving forward on this one. The gameplay of the game gets a 5 out of 10 with a potential of 8.5. Some of you might think that 5 out of 10 is harsh, but hear me out. There is very limited content in the game, and that's true even considering it's an early access title. You'll likely get bored of playing the one single map 1v1 against the AI, and the Horde mode will lose its novelty as well due to the same reason. Multiplayer suffers from the same issues, and not having any matchmaking or elo system will definitely make online games hit or miss for most players. The reason why the potential is so high though is due to how nimble the developers can be to add the missing features. Heck, I had to rewrite and re-record a chunk of my review because the game only had Horde mode available to play when I first received the pre-release copy of the game. And they added skirmish mode before I could even publish my review. Hence, although gameplay is severely lacking right now, the developers have acknowledged a lot of the missing features, and they should be able to add them sometime in the future for entertaining gameplay and high replay value. Graphics and visuals get a 7 out of 10, with a potential of 7.5. For a pixel game, it's decent. I've seen some absolutely gorgeous pixel games in the past that would easily get a 9 or above in this department, but the Fertile Crescent isn't special. It has a cute art style and mostly clear visuals, so I think the score is fair. The 0.5 added to the potential score stems from the clarity issues, especially revolving around units that they need to address, but I don't expect any major improvements to justify a higher potential. The controls get a 6 with a potential of 10. We have just enough control here to play the game, but the lack of hotkey customization, lack of zoom, lack of formations or advanced army control, lack of options such as resolution and audio settings, lack of modding or scenario editor, and many more hurt the score. The potential being a 10 simply stems from the fact that every single pain point here is easily addressable, and is quite realistic to expect the developers to implement them sometime in the future. The engine runs very smoothly as expected, so I think it's just a matter of time till they address all of these issues. Sound and music, although admittedly a bit subjective, get a 5, with a potential of being an 8. Replacing some of the irritating in-game sounds to fit better with each event, adding some more variety music so it doesn't keep looping or making me anxious, and adding grunts and death sounds to make combat more satisfying should not be a large ask for the devs. I don't foresee the sounds going above an 8, as that will require a major overhaul of the in-game music and adding a ton of new sounds, which I'm not sure is realistic for an indie game company to reinvest their money in. All in all, the Fertile Crescent, as it stands, gets a 6 out of 10 for me, with a potential of becoming an 8 out of 10 game. There are simply too many missing things in the game right now that need to be addressed before I could give it a higher score. Do I think the game is worth $15 as an early access title in its current state? No. Here's the thing, folks. There's definitely a fun game somewhere in there. There is potential. You could definitely choose to pay the $15 as a token of support for the developers and join them in their journey towards the final release of the game. If you're one of those people who are happy to spend the time and money because you like what you see so far and enjoy being a part of a niche community, then all power to you. And I do recommend you to support the devs as well. But if you're simply looking for a new RTS game to spend $15 on today to play solo or with friends, and don't have the patience to give the game the time and feedback that it needs to become the game you'd like to play, then I'd wait until the full release of the game and read some reviews to see what have the developers added since the early access launch. I guarantee you that my review will be mostly obsolete by then, and the Fertile Crescent just might reach the 8 out of 10 potential that I see in it. Overall, there is an honest effort here. The Fertile Crescent is not an Age of Empires clone when it could have easily been. It tries to stay familiar to the historical RTS formula while innovating on some aspects. Making an RTS game in 2022 is not easy, and certainly not for an indie developer, so I do commend the developers for their work so far. They do have a long way to go till I can comfortably recommend their game to others, but I'm hopeful that they will reach there one day. I will keep a close eye out on what they can achieve in the upcoming months or years post-launch, and may let you folks know if it reaches its potential. Until then, consider buying the Fertile Crescent as an investment for a potentially fun RTS game that is far from finished as of March 2022. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this in-depth review of the Fertile Crescent. Just as a reminder, the game will release as an early access title on March 29th, and I've linked their Steam page in the pinned comment below for you to add to your wishlist if you're interested. I've also linked their Discord channel if you'd like to be a part of the community and provide feedback directly to the developers. As a token of gratitude, the developers have also shared with me 5 keys of the game that I will share with you folks. If you'd like to be considered for the giveaway, then simply ensure that you're subscribed to Age of Noob and type #TFC giveaway at the end of your regular comment. I will randomly pick 5 winners at the end of the week. I want to thank the Knights of Unity once more for sponsoring this video, as well as providing some free Steam keys of TFC for our community to enjoy. And finally, many thanks to the first Patreons who have generously pledged their support to my channel. And if you'd like to join those folks, you can find the Patreon link below the like button. As always, thanks for watching everyone. Your feedback for this game review will be much appreciated, and see you all in the next one.